My mother-in-law called me on a Wednesday afternoon, the specific dead center of the week afternoon when I was at my desk reviewing quarterly projections and had exactly zero capacity for drama, and said, in the tone of a woman delivering a reasonable request rather than an act of insanity, "Lena, we need to discuss Ina's wedding budget. I've put together the numbers, and your share comes to 480,000 rubles. My share of a wedding I hadn't been invited to, for a sister-in-law who hadn't spoken to me in 2 years. Organized by a mother-in-law who had introduced me at the last family gathering as Grisha's first wife. Oh wait, current wife. I keep mixing that up. 480,000 rubles. Roughly 5 months of my salary, calculated down to the thousand, presented to me as a line item in someone else's celebration from which I had been explicitly, deliberately, by printed invitation and seating chart, excluded. "I'm sorry," I said, in the voice I use with vendors who send incorrect invoices. Polite, precise, leaving no room for interpretation. "My share of what?" "The wedding, Lena. Ina's wedding. You know this has been planned for months. The venue alone is 800,000 and the catering—" "Raisa Dmitrievna, I wasn't invited to Ina's wedding." "What does that have to do with anything?" "Your family. Family contributes. Family gets invited. I didn't. The guest list is Ina's decision. The budget is a family matter. Those are two separate things." "They are not two separate things. They are one thing, and the thing is, you want me to pay for a party I'm not allowed to attend. And the answer is no." The silence that followed was the specific silence of a woman who has been told no so infrequently in her 61 years that the word registers not as a response but as an error, a glitch in the system, a misfired signal that will surely correct itself if she waits long enough. She waited. I didn't correct myself. "We'll discuss this at dinner on Saturday," she said, and hung up. We would not discuss this at dinner on Saturday, but I didn't tell her that yet. Because the story of how I sent my mother-in-law to the pawn shop requires context. And the context requires going back to the beginning, to the day I entered the Volkov family and discovered that the price of admission was negotiable, the terms were unclear, and the management was hostile. My name is Elena Andreevna Volkova. Everyone calls me Lena. I'm 33 and I live in Yekaterinburg with my husband, Grisha, Volkov, 35, and our son, Artyom, who is 6 and who is, by a significant margin, the only Volkov who has never tried to extract money from me under the guise of family obligation. I work as a financial analyst at a mining equipment company, a job that pays 94,000 rubles a month, requires a degree in economics that took me 5 years to earn, and involves the daily application of a skill that my mother-in-law considers irrelevant to my primary function, which, in her taxonomy, is wife of Grisha, mother of Artyom, and funding source for whatever the Volkov family needs funded. Grisha is a good man. I want to state this clearly, because in these stories the husband is often the villain, and Grisha is not a villain. He is a good man with a weak spine, a man who loves his wife and fears his mother and has spent 35 years trying to satisfy both, which is like trying to satisfy both gravity and flight. Technically possible, practically exhausting, and sustainable only as long as nobody asks you to choose. Grisha works as a site manager for a construction company. He earns 78,000 a month. Decent money, honest money. The salary of a man who stands in cold weather and manages crews and comes home tired in a way that I respect even when I'm frustrated with everything else about him. He is good with Artyom. He is good with me. He is catastrophically bad with his mother, because Raisa Dmitrievna Volkova is a woman who has spent 3 decades training her children the way certain countries train soldiers, through a combination of love, guilt, and the absolute certainty that disobedience is betrayal. Raisa Dmitrievna, 61, retired bookkeeper, a profession she held for 28 years at a textile factory, and that gave her 2 skills, an understanding of ledgers and an unshakable belief that every relationship is a ledger, with debits and credits that must balance, and that the person who controls the ledger controls the relationship. She had been widowed for 5 years. Her husband, Dmitry Ivanovich, had died of liver failure, a slow and terrible death that Raisa Dmitrievna had managed with the same grim efficiency she applied to everything. Organized, unsentimental, and expensive, because the medical care had consumed most of the family's savings and left Raisa Dmitrievna in a position she found intolerable, dependent. Raisa Dmitrievna did not do dependent. Dependent was for other women. Women without plans, without ledgers, without the specific, relentless resourcefulness of a retired bookkeeper who understood that money is not earned but managed, and that management includes identifying which members of your family have money and constructing systems to redirect it. The systems were sophisticated, not criminal. Raisa Dmitrievna was not a thief. She was an architect of obligation. She built structures of guilt and expectation so intricate, so load-bearing, so integrated into the emotional architecture of the Volkov family that extracting yourself from one required dismantling several others. You couldn't refuse a request without triggering a cascade of consequences. Hurt feelings, family meetings, phone calls from siblings who had been briefed on your betrayal. And the ultimate weapon, Raisa Dmitrievna's silence, which was not the absence of communication but the presence of judgment, held indefinitely, withdrawn only when compliance was achieved. I entered this system 7 years ago when Grisha and I married. I entered it the way a person enters a building without reading the fire code. Confidently, naively, assuming that the structure was sound and the exits were clearly marked. The exits were not clearly marked. The exits were, in fact, hidden behind walls of obligation that Raisa Dmitrievna had been constructing since before I arrived. The first extraction attempt came 6 months into the marriage, a family contribution to the renovation of Raisa Dmitrievna's kitchen. 25,000 rubles presented as a shared responsibility, calculated as a fraction of a larger number that nobody was allowed to verify. Grisha paid it without discussion. I asked to see the full budget. Raisa Dmitrievna looked at me as though I'd requested access to classified military documents. "The budget is my concern," she said. "Your concern is your share." My share. The phrase she would use for 7 years, across dozens of requests, each one calibrated to extract the maximum amount while maintaining the fiction of collective responsibility. My share of the kitchen renovation. My share of Raisa Dmitrievna's dental work. My share of the family's New Year's celebration. My share of a vacation to Sochi that Grisha and I were not available to attend but were expected to fund. I paid. For the first 2 years, I paid, not because I agreed, but because the cost of paying was lower than the cost of refusing, and because Grisha, standing between his wife and his mother, looked so exhausted by the prospect of conflict that I chose peace over principle. Peace over principle. The trade-off that every daughter-in-law in every family obligation system eventually faces, and that every daughter-in-law eventually stops making, because peace purchased with money is not peace. It's rent. And the rent keeps going up. The rent went up. The requests grew larger, more frequent, more creatively justified. Raisa Dmitrievna needed a new washing machine. Her share of the cost was, mysteriously, 0. Inna, Grisha's younger sister, 27, needed help with a car repair. The help was financial, the car was a year old, and the repair was elective. Raisa Dmitrievna's apartment needed new windows. The windows were installed by a contractor who was also Raisa Dmitrievna's nephew, and the price was 40% above market. And when I mentioned this, I was told that questioning the price was insulting to family. Insulting to family. The phrase that ended every objection. The trump card. The rhetorical weapon that converted financial scrutiny into moral failure and that ensured compliance by making the alternative, refusal, synonymous with disloyalty. I stopped paying in year 3. Not dramatically, quietly, gradually, with the incremental boundary setting that therapy had taught me and that Raisa Dmitrievna had not anticipated, because Raisa Dmitrievna did not believe in therapy. She believed in ledgers, and in her ledger, the Lena column was still active. The stopping was noticed. Not immediately. Raisa Dmitrievna's system had inertia, and the initial missed payments were absorbed by the momentum of previous compliance. But eventually, the absence of my contributions registered, and the response was calibrated. Not confrontation, but recalibration. If Lena wouldn't pay voluntarily, the requests would be routed through Grisha, who would pay from the joint account, which would effectively extract the money from Lena by proxy. I caught this. I caught it because I am a financial analyst, and financial analysts read bank statements the way other people read novels. For plot, for character, for the hidden patterns that reveal what's really happening beneath the surface. I saw the withdrawals. I traced them to Raisa Dmitrievna. I confronted Grisha. Your mother is withdrawing money from our joint account through you. She needed 18,000 rubles for a plumber. The plumber's invoice was for 11,000. The difference, 7,000, went where? Mama said the plumber charged. The plumber's name is Anatoly. He works for the same company that services our building. I called him. 11,000. Your mother invoiced us for 18. Grisha looked at me with the expression of a man whose two gravitational fields have just collided and who is being torn apart by the physics. He didn't defend his mother. He didn't defend himself. He sat at the kitchen table and put his head in his hands and said, I know she does this. I've always known. Then why do you let her? Because saying no to my mother is... You don't understand what it's like. She calls. She cries. She says Papa would be ashamed. She says I'm abandoning her. She says whatever works. Because it's always worked. Because you've never said no, so she's never had to stop asking. That conversation was 2 years ago. Since then, Grisha and I had established a system. Separate accounts for personal spending, a joint account for household expenses with dual authorization for withdrawals over 5,000 rubles, and a boundary, spoken, explicit, non-negotiable, that Raisa Dmitrievna's financial needs would be addressed through transparent, documented, mutually agreed contributions, not through back-channel extractions disguised as plumbing invoices. Raisa Dmitrievna had not accepted this system. She had acknowledged it, the way a besieging army acknowledges a wall, by looking for ways around it. Inna's wedding was the way around it. Inna, Grisha's sister, 27, a hairdresser at a salon in the center of Yekaterinburg, was marrying a man named Vadim, 29, who worked at a car dealership and who possessed the particular, confident charm of a man who sells things for a living, and who had apparently sold Inna on the idea of a wedding that cost, by Raisa Dmitrievna's calculations, 1,600,000 rubles. 1,600,000 for a hairdresser and a car salesman in Yekaterinburg. The number was not merely large, it was architecturally ambitious, a structure of expense that required multiple load-bearing contributors and that Raisa Dmitrievna had designed with the same precision she'd brought to every financial extraction of the past 7 years. The budget, which I eventually obtained through Grisha, who obtained it through the specific, exhausting process of asking his mother 4 times and being refused 3 times, and finally receiving a handwritten document that looked like it had been prepared by a Cold War intelligence agency, was as follows. Venue, 800,000. Catering, 300,000. Photographer and videographer, 120,000. Flowers, 80,000. Dress and suit, 150,000. Music and entertainment, 150,000. Total, 1,600,000. The funding plan was as follows. Vadim's family, 400,000. Raisa Dmitrievna, 200,000. Inna and Vadim, 520,000. And Grisha's family, Raisa Dmitrievna's euphemism for me, 480,000. 480,000 rubles, my share. 30% of a wedding budget for a celebration I had not been invited to. Because I had not been invited. The invitation list, a document I also eventually obtained, included 140 guests. Raisa Dmitrievna, Grisha, Artyom, every cousin, aunt, uncle, colleague, and neighbor in the Volkov and Vadim orbits. But not me. Not Elena Andreevna Volkova. Not the woman who was being asked to contribute 480,000 rubles to a party that the hosts had decided she should fund, but not attend. The exclusion was Inna's. I knew this because Inna and I had a history. A specific, documented 2-year history of hostility that had begun when I'd refused to lend Inna 60,000 rubles for a vacation to Turkey, and that had escalated through a series of confrontations, social media subtexts, and family dinners during which Inna addressed everyone at the table except me. Inna didn't like me. Inna had decided, with the absolute, immovable conviction of a 27-year-old who has never been told she's wrong, that I was cold, controlling, and not really family. The last phrase delivered at a New Year's dinner 2 years ago, in front of the entire Volkov family. with the casual cruelty of a person who knows she will not be contradicted. She was not contradicted. Not by Raisa Dmitrievna, who heard the phrase and said nothing. Not by Grisha, who heard the phrase and looked at his plate. Not by anyone at the table, because the Volkov family operated on a principle that I had come to understand as foundational. Inna was the youngest. Inna was the daughter. Inna was Raisa Dmitrievna's favorite. And Inna's behavior, however cruel, however unjustified, was protected by the same force field that protected Raisa Dmitrievna's financial extractions. Family. The word that excused everything. So I was not invited. But I was invoiced. Saturday dinner. Raisa Dmitrievna's apartment. The table set for 6. Raisa Dmitrievna, Grisha, Artyom, Inna, Vadim, and me. The first time I'd been in the same room as Inna in 4 months, and the first time in 2 years that I'd been included in a Volkov family event, which should have told me everything about the purpose of the invitation. I was not being included. I was being positioned. Dinner was tense in the specific way that Russian family dinners are tense when money is the actual subject and food is the ostensible one. Raisa Dmitrievna served her signature dish, a roast that was always slightly dry and that everyone complimented because complimenting the roast was a prerequisite for surviving the evening. Conversation moved through the safe topics, Artyom's school, Vadim's dealership, the weather, with the choreographed precision of a family avoiding the thing they'd gathered to discuss. Raisa Dmitrievna introduced the topic over tea, not abruptly, with the gradual, inevitable approach of a woman who understands timing the way a conductor understands tempo. So, she said, the wedding. We need to finalize the budget. She produced a folder, an actual folder, printed, tabbed, color-coded. The budget I'd already seen, plus additional pages. A payment schedule, a list of vendors, and a column labeled Grisha/Lena with the number 480,000 circled in red. I've outlined everyone's contributions, Raisa Dmitrievna said. Vadim's family has confirmed their share. Inna and Vadim are covering their portion. I'm contributing from my savings. And Grisha's family? She looked at me, not at Grisha, because we both knew who Grisha's family meant. Is responsible for 480,000. I looked at the folder, at the red circle, at the number that represented 5 months of my salary, allocated to a celebration that the woman sitting across from me, Inna, who hadn't spoken to me, who hadn't looked at me, who was studying her phone with the focused disengagement of a person who considers the conversation beneath her attention, had decided I was not welcome to attend. No, I said. The table went quiet. Not the gradual, natural quiet of a conversation pausing, the abrupt, pressurized quiet of a room in which a word has been spoken that violates the operating code. I'm sorry, Raisa Dmitrievna said. No, I will not contribute 480,000 rubles to Inna's wedding. Lena, this is a family decision. Then let me explain my decision. I wasn't invited to the wedding. I'm not on the guest list. I was not consulted about the budget, the venue, the catering, or any of the decisions that produced this number. I was presented with an invoice for a party I'm not allowed to attend, organized by people who have not spoken to me in 2 years, and I am declining the invoice. Inna looked up from her phone. The first direct eye contact in 4 months. Nobody asked you to come. Exactly. Nobody asked me to come, but somebody asked me to pay. And those two things, Inna, the not inviting, and the asking to pay, cannot coexist. You don't get to exclude me from the guest list and include me on the budget. That's not family. That's a contractor. And contractors get paid. They don't pay. Raisa Dmitrievna's face underwent the transformation I'd seen before. The shift from reasonable request to controlled fury. The transition from bookkeeper to general. You are Grisha's wife. You are part of this family. And this family supports each other. This family asks me for money and excludes me from celebrations. That is not support. That is extraction. And I have been extracted from Raisa Dmitrievna for 7 years. The kitchen renovation, the dental work, the windows, the plumber who charged 11,000 but invoiced 18. 7 years of your share. 7 years of contributions to a family that treats me as a funding source and not a member. And I've paid. Every time I've paid. Not anymore. Grisha, Raisa Dmitrievna said, turning to her son. The activation command. The single word that meant, control your wife. Grisha looked at me. I looked at him. And I saw in his face the thing I'd been waiting 7 years to see. A decision. Mom, Grisha said, Lena's right. The room shifted, not visibly, atmospherically. The pressure changed. Raisa Dmitrievna's face did something I'd never seen it do. It registered surprise. Not the performative surprise of a woman who has anticipated resistance and prepared a response. Real surprise. The surprise of a general whose army has defected. Lena wasn't invited. Grisha continued. She's not on the guest list. I've seen it. And you're asking her to pay almost 500,000 rubles for a wedding she can't attend. Mom, that doesn't make sense. Even by your rules, that doesn't make sense. My rules. Your rules. The ones where family contributes. Fine. Family contributes, but family also includes. You can't have the contribution without the inclusion. That's not a family. That's a subscription service. Inna put down her phone. This is my wedding. I decide who comes. And that's your right, I said. Absolutely. It's your wedding, your guest list, your decision. But it's my money. And my money follows me. If I'm not at the table, my money's not at the table. That's not spite, Inna. That's arithmetic. Inna looked at Raisa Dmitrievna. Raisa Dmitrievna looked at the folder. At the red circle. At the number that was now not a contribution, but a hole. 480,000 rubles of hole in a budget that had been designed to balance and was now collapsing. Then the wedding can't happen, Raisa Dmitrievna said. Quietly. The quiet of a woman playing her last card. The catastrophe card. The card that says, if you don't pay, everything falls apart. And the falling apart is your fault. The wedding can happen, I said. At a budget that matches the contributions of the people who are actually hosting it. You have 400,000 from Vadim's family, 520,000 from Inna and Vadim, and 200,000 from you. That's 1,120,000 rubles. More than enough for a beautiful wedding. Not the wedding you planned, a different wedding. A wedding that costs what the host can afford. The way weddings are supposed to work. 1,120,000 won't cover. It will cover a venue that costs 400,000 instead of 800. Catering at 150 instead of 300. Flowers at 40 instead of 80. A photographer at 60 instead of 120. I've done the math. Raisa Dmitrievna. I'm a financial analyst. Math is what I do. I reached into my bag and produced my own folder. Printed, tabbed, organized. The mirror image of Raisa Dmitrievna's folder, except mine contained an alternative budget. A realistic budget. A budget that allocated 1,120,000 rubles across the same categories at market rates, without the inflated numbers that Raisa Dmitrievna's version contained. Venue. There's a restaurant called Zolotoy Bereg on the south side. They do weddings. Capacity 120. 400,000 for the full package. Venue, basic catering, table settings. I called them on Thursday. You called them? I called them because I knew this conversation was coming and I wanted to have an answer that wasn't just no. The answer is, the wedding can happen. Beautifully for what you can actually afford. You just have to want the wedding more than you want my money. I set the folder on the table beside Raisa Dmitrievna's folder. 2 folders, 2 budgets, 2 versions of the same event. One that required my subsidization and one that didn't. Raisa Dmitrievna looked at both folders. At the numbers, at the tabs and the categories and the precise analytical layout of a woman who had spent a decade reading budgets and who had applied that skill, finally, definitively, to the one budget that Raisa Dmitrievna had not expected to be audited. You want me to downgrade my daughter's wedding? I want you to fund your daughter's wedding. With your money, that's not a downgrade. That's responsibility. And if the gap between what you have and what you want is too large, if the wedding you planned requires 480,000 rubles from a woman who isn't even invited, then the problem isn't my refusal. The problem is your plan. The silence lasted a long time. Long enough for Artyom, who had been quietly eating bread throughout the entire exchange, to look up and say, "Can I have more bread?" "Yes, sweetheart," I said. He took more bread. The table remained frozen around him. 4 adults and 1 car salesman, suspended in the aftermath of a confrontation that had rearranged the financial architecture of the Volkov family. Inna spoke first. To Raisa Dmitrievna, not to me. "Mama, can we cover it? Without her?" The word her, spoken with the specific dismissive inflection that Inna used for me exclusively, the pronoun that served as both reference and rejection. Without her. "The numbers are tight," Raisa Dmitrievna said, slowly, the way a person speaks when they're calculating in real time and the calculation is producing results they don't like. "Then maybe—" Inna stopped, looked at the 2 folders, looked at Vadim, who had been silent throughout the dinner with the practiced neutrality of a man who sells cars and knows when to stop talking. "Vadim, can your family—" "We've given what we can," Vadim said. Firmly, simply, the first useful sentence he'd contributed all evening. The room settled into the particular silence that follows the collapse of a plan. Not angry silence, not grieving silence, but the silence of recalculation. The silence of people who are staring at numbers that don't add up and who are beginning to understand that the numbers won't add up because the assumptions behind them were wrong. "The pawn shop," Raisa Dmitrievna said. Everyone looked at her. "My jewelry, Dmitri's watch, the gold chain from your grandmother." She was looking at Inna. "I can pawn them. That should cover some of the gap." "Mama, no. It's your wedding, Inochka. My daughter's wedding. I'll manage." This was the moment Raisa Dmitrievna had been building toward, not consciously, not strategically, but with the instinct of a woman who understands that the most powerful move in any negotiation is sacrifice. If I won't pay, she'll sacrifice. She'll pawn her jewelry. She'll sell the gold chain. She'll perform the maternal martyrdom that transforms my refusal into her suffering, that converts my boundary into her loss, that reframes the entire conflict so that I am not the woman who said no, but the woman who sent her mother-in-law to the pawn shop. I recognized the move. I recognized it because I'd seen it before. Smaller versions, calibrated for smaller extractions. The sigh when I refused a contribution. The mention of her tight pension. The strategic reference to Dmitry Ivanovich's medical bills and how they'd cleaned out everything. The vocabulary of sacrifice deployed to override the vocabulary of boundaries. "Raisa Dmitrievna," I said, "you are not going to the pawn shop. It's not your decision. You're right. It's yours. And I'm telling you, as a financial analyst, as a member of this family, whether Inna's guest list acknowledges it or not, and as a woman who has spent 7 years watching you manage money, you are not going to pawn your jewelry to cover a budget gap that exists because you planned a wedding you can't afford." I opened my folder. The alternative budget. The realistic numbers. Zolotoy Bereg, 400,000, 120 guests, beautiful room, river view, excellent food. I've seen photographs. I've read reviews. It's a real venue for a real wedding that real people can afford. I pushed the folder toward Inna. Not toward Raisa Dmitrievna. Toward Inna. Because the wedding was Inna's and the decision was Inna's. And the woman who had excluded me from the guest list needed to be the woman who decided whether to accept help from the person she'd excluded. Inna looked at the folder. At the photographs I'd printed. The venue. The tables. The river view. At the numbers. Each one sourced. Each one verified. Each one reflecting the actual market rate for wedding services in Yekaterinburg, not the inflated rates in Raisa Dmitrievna's budget. "This is actually nice," Inna said. Quietly, reluctantly, with the tone of a woman conceding something to someone she doesn't want to concede anything to. "It's your wedding," I said. "It should be beautiful. And it can be at a price that doesn't require anyone to pawn anything or pay for a party they're not invited to." Inna looked at me. The first look in 2 years that wasn't hostile, wasn't dismissive, wasn't the practice non-seeing that she'd been performing since the Turkey loan refusal. This look was different. Uncertain, evaluating. The look of a person who is recalculating someone else's value. Why did you do this? She asked. The research. The budget. Why? Because you're Grisha's sister. Because you're Artyom's aunt. Because family. Actual family. Not the version where one person pays and another person benefits, and nobody says thank you. Means helping with what you can. I can't give you 480,000 rubles. I can give you a spreadsheet that saves you 480,000 rubles. And in my profession, that's worth more. The wedding happened in June. At Zolotoy Bereg, Riverview, 112 guests, a menu that included 3 courses and a dessert table, and a cake that Inna had chosen herself from a bakery that charged 40,000 instead of the 90,000 in Raisa Dmitrievna's original budget. I was there. Not because Inna invited me gracefully. She didn't. The invitation was extended through Grisha, awkwardly, 2 weeks after the Saturday dinner, with the specific phrasing, Inna says you should come. Not wants you to come. Says you should come. The distinction mattered, but I accepted it, because should from Inna was progress, and progress is built in increments, not leaps. I wore a dress I already owned. I sat at the family table. I watched Inna dance with Vadim, and I watched Raisa Dmitrievna cry. The real tears of a mother watching her daughter marry, not the strategic tears of a woman leveraging emotion. And I watched Grisha hold Artyom on his shoulders so he could see the first dance, and I felt for the first time in 7 years like a member of the family rather than a subscriber. Raisa Dmitrievna didn't pawn anything. Her jewelry stayed in her drawer. Dmitry Ivanovich's watch stayed on the shelf where she kept it, beside his photograph, where it belonged. The gold chain from Inna's grandmother stayed around Raisa Dmitrievna's neck, where it hung during the wedding, catching the light from the river through the restaurant windows. After the ceremony, Raisa Dmitrievna approached me. Not at the table, in the corridor, away from the guests, in the specific privacy that difficult words require. The venue was good, she said. It was. The food was good. It was. Inna looked beautiful. She did. A pause. The pause of a woman assembling something she's not accustomed to assembling. I'm not going to say you were right. I don't need you to. But I will say, the spreadsheet helped. From Raisa Dmitrievna, this was a concession of approximately the same magnitude as a formal apology from a head of state. I received it with the gravity it deserved. You're welcome, Raisa Dmitrievna. She nodded, returned to the party, danced with Artyom, who stood on her feet and laughed, and the gold chain around her neck caught the light, and she was not at a pawn shop. She was at her daughter's wedding. A beautiful wedding. A wedding that cost what the family could afford. Inna sent me a text the following week. Not a long text. Inna communicated in the compressed, emoji-adjacent language of her generation. The text said, "The venue was perfect. Thank you." 2 sentences. No emoji. From Inna, this was the equivalent of a handwritten letter on embossed stationery. I replied, "You're welcome. Congratulations." The ledger is not balanced. 7 years of extraction are not erased by one wedding and one text and one corridor conversation about spreadsheets. Raisa Dmitrievna is still Raisa Dmitrievna. Still a woman who thinks in debits and credits. Still a mother who considers her children's resources extensions of her own. But something shifted. Something cracked. Not broke. Cracked in the system she'd built. And through the crack, a different possibility entered. The possibility that a family can function without a funding hierarchy. That no is not betrayal. That a daughter-in-law who refuses to pay for a wedding she wasn't invited to is not cold or controlling, but correct. Correct. The word I'll take. Not loved, not accepted, not embraced. Correct. In a family that operates on ledgers, being correct is the highest compliment available. And I'll take it. I'll take it the way I take everything in this family. Carefully, with documentation and with a backup spreadsheet in my bag. Just in case.